I'm Sarah Kermanian, a contributor to the Amargi. Today, I have the honor of interviewing Dr. Mehran Rezaei Toroghi, honorary research fellow at the School of Law, Politics and Sociology at the University of Sussex in Britain, on the topic of state feminism and women's rights during the Pahlavi-era in Iran. In recent years, particularly since the Women Life Freedom Movement or the Jin Uprising in 2022, the question of women's rights has been at the center of all the political debates about Iran's past, present, and future. One narrative that has gained significant traction, especially after the decline of the women right freedom movement and with the surge of Pahlavism, is the one that portrays the Pahlavi era as the golden age not only of national progress, but also for Iranian women. Circulated widely in diaspora spaces and on social media, images from the 1960s and 1970s show unveiled women in universities, workplaces, and public life as symbols of a lost modernity that evoke the imagination of the glory of an ancient past. Monarchies claimed that a return to Pahlavi rule could satisfy both women's demands as well as restoring national greatness. But how accurate is this nostalgic narrative? To what extent did women's rights truly expand during the Pahlavi period? And under what political conditions were these changes and reforms enacted? To explore these questions, we must move beyond simplified comparisons between the past and present and examine how reforms were introduced, who controlled them, what political objectives they served, and their lasting consequences. So without further ado, I turn to Dr. Rezaei to unpack this complex history and challenge the myths of Pahlavi-era state feminism. Dr. Rezaei holds a PhD in philosophy from Shahid Beheshti University in Iran and has completed two postdoctoral fellowships in the UK. At SOAS, he critically examined Foucauldian approaches to the history of sexuality in Iran, and at Sussex, he served as a research fellow on the Negotiating Queer Identities Following Forced Migration project. And overall, he brings extensive expertise on theories of gender and sexuality and their history in Iran. Dr. Rezaei, thank you for joining us. As I said, today many people nostalgically refer to the Pahlavi period as a golden age of women's rights in Iran. Why do you think this narrative has become so influential in current debates about Iran's future, and how accurate is this perception historically?
Well, thank you very much, Sarah, for having me in this discussion. Let me start with a disclaimer, actually, because I need to refer to my positionality. And as a male scholar, I'm not speaking from my lived experiences as a feminist or feminist activist or scholar. So my responses draws on feminist scholarship that's been released and published in 1990s until 2000, and historical documents from that period, and also my own account as somebody who is involved in intellectual history. Responding to this timing question that you raised, I would like to share something about how there is a kind of circulation of image and affect recently. So, after 4 decades of legal and institutional restrictions on women, such as, mandatory hijab and institutional restrictions for women for access to the public and discriminatory family laws, and also limits on bodily autonomy and public participation. So there is a sort of aversion against this current situation that people are involved in. And the past can easily appear as a last moment of freedom. So in that sense, nostalgia often is a way to imagine a utopic future from the lens of a glamorized or romanticized sort of past. And this is the dynamic that actually is going on right now. The circulation of image also matters because, photographs of women in Tehran in 1960s, 1970s, veiled, educated, employed, and publicly visible. Those images have become widely shared through social media and with diaspora networks, and even AI-generated visuals matters as well. And they recreated a kind of cosmopolitan image of women from the past that could be nostalgic and there could be a solution for the possible future. So because of this image, are often stripped of the context, of the historical context. They can produce a powerful and simplified image of the modern Iran that has been lost, actually. So a more careful account should therefore recognize that the Pahlavi period did bring significant reform, actually. Nobody can ignore it. But the thing is that these progression were introduced within an authoritarian and state-driven model. So the issue is not whether changes occurred, but how it occurred and who control it and what is the long consequences of this progression in the past.
So these reforms you're talking about, what reforms concerning women's rights were implemented during the Pahlavi era, and how did the state's approach to modernization shape these policies?
Well, if we look historically, there were important reforms under both monarchs, Pahlavi, the son and the father, Reza Shah, and Muhammad Reza Shah. Under Reza Shah, the state expanded girls' education, promoted women's entry into public life, introduced co-educational primary schooling in 1936, and most famously enforced unveiling so-called Kashfa hijab through the 1936. That was very important and famous policy by Reza Shah. These reforms significantly altered women's visibility in public space, but they were imposed, as I said before, from above as part of a centralizing secular modernization project. So under Muhammad Reza Shah, reforms were more extensive, especially in terms of education and having access to public space. Women gained suffrage in 1963 as part of a white revolution, so-called Inqilab al-Safid. And they also gained greater access to public office. Education also promoted, and professional life for women were more possible than before. The Family Protection Law in 1967, later expanded in 1975, actually. That improved significantly women's positions in marriage, divorce, custody, and also polygamy was more restricted. The women organization that was really important at that time, founded in 1966, promoted literacy, legal awareness for women, health initiatives, and they had some vocational training across the nation, across the country. So that was really significant achievement for both monarchs, Muhammad Reza Shah and Reza Shah. Yet, the key points is that these reforms were not simply the result of a democratic women's mobilization, transforming the state from below, from the grassroots. It was not started from that point. So they were incorporated into a monarchy-led modernization project that was deeply authoritarian, centralizing, and paternalistic.
Okay, I understand that these reforms were top down, but what's the problem with this? I mean, in what ways is this modernization project authoritarian, centralizing, and paternalistic, as you just mentioned?
Well, exactly, I mean, against what I said. This is authoritarian, and there are some authoritarian dimension because it is visible from the beginning when you back to Reza Shah. Reza Shah, under Reza Shah kingship, autonomous women's organizations were increasingly marginalized. Then they are suppressed and absorbed to the state program. Women's activism, actually before that era, I mean in 1920s, they had retained some independence through associations and journals that they had. But by 1930s, the state claimed ownership of a women's emancipation. Shah started to be the champion of women's movement. Reform did not disappear. I mean, the independent activism did not disappear, but it was taken over. I mean, the whole cause and what has been crusaded by women has been taken over by the state. It was centralizing because women's issues were folded into the monarchy's broader project of building a unified modern nation state. Women were treated as a crucial to producing a disciplined, educated, and productive population. Reforming women because it was part of this nation building was more crucial in that program. So women became more part of a reforming the nation as a better mother, as a better family, better wife, better citizens, and therefore that there would be a strong state as a result of this participation of women in a state program, in state projects, actually. So it was paternalistic as well, because women were not primarily imagined as a political subjects acting in their own rights. They were treated as a recipient of reform granted by a male sovereign, the father of nation, the Shah, and the state elite. So the Shah appeared as a father of nation who bestows, emancipation to women. Even when women's inclusion expanded, um, it often remained framed as something bestowed from above rather than achieved through autonomous sort of political struggle.
Well, thank you, Mehran. One of the most well-known policies of that period was the Kashf Hijab program, or the banning of veil. Could we see this as an example of centralized and paternalistic character of the state's modernization project?
Yes, sure. It is very clear in that program, the so-called Kashf Hijab unveiling policy was not framed. Actually, if we look into the documents remain from that period, it's not framed as sort of women's freedom to choose their dresses. It is just all. I mean, it is absolutely different program. If we see and scrutinize the documents remain from that period, it was presented as part of a broader project of social reform and national progress. Government's documents from the 1930s show that the official repeatedly described the reform of women's condition and education as essential to the strength of the nation. Uh, a striking feature of the policy was the standardization of appearance. It is more about that. I mean, this sort of standardization and uniformization of women's appearance in the public. Officials discussed the modernization of women's clothing in highly regulated terms, including what kind of coats and hats should be worn, how affordable they should be. So they were really concerned about, is that a sort of etiquette that they are instructing to the officer are affordable for people in a remote area, I mean, in the country. So it is all about how they could uniform this population. It shows that the aim was not simply to remove the veil. It is not actually Kashf Hijab. It is all about uniformization of the population and produce a uniform national image of the modern Iranian woman. And moral regulation was also part of the project. I mean, it is not just about what it is pretended. There are some moral concerns in this program. The state wanted respectable, for example, that's really shocking and amazing philosophically. The state wanted the respectable woman to be represented the new image of modernity, while excluding prostitute, for example, the so-called ma'rufa appeared in that documents. They were because they were considered as immoral or socially undesirable. So by excluding prostitutes from the Kashf Hijab program, the government tried to reconfigure the semiology of decency and modesty. Everybody who is still attached to veiling were supposed to be similar to prostitutes. And that is the moral tactics that they were using to internalize the dress codes for women. But actually it didn't work because, there was some coercion eventually. And the case of Guarshad Mosque in Mashhad was one of the examples showing that there was some social cost for spoken.
Thank you. So I can see that basically you're seeing all these gender and gender reforms basically as part of the whole process of creating a nation, a state. So let's move to the second Pahlavi period, the White Revolution, which basically was a set of reforms, basically conducted by the state, but then was framed in this language of using the phrase revolution. It's often presented as a milestone for women's rights reform in the Pahlavi dynasty too, particularly because it introduced women's suffrage. How significant was this reform and how did it emerge?
Well, basically, women's suffrage was historically significant in Iran, but it did not emerge out of nowhere in 1963. The demand for women's political rights has been a long and a much longer history. So reaching back to the constitutional period in Qajar, in early Qajar periods, and in that sense, the Pahlavi state appropriated an older demand and reframed it as a royal reform. The framing matters here because women's suffrage was presented not as a result of a collective struggle, but as a gift granted by Shah. Citizenship was thus turned into something bestowed from above. This is why scholars sometimes describe this reform, which is just about a paternalistic model of citizenship. So the reform was also woven into the regime's broader image of modernization. Women's enfranchisement was used to show that the monarchy was progressive and forward-looking. So in this narrative, women were not simply citizens, they were also symbols of the state's legitimacy. It is part of the nation building, obviously. The Shah's own speech after the White Revolution, when he gave the right to vote to women, that's actually a gift that he gave. He actually demonstrated his logic. He repeatedly spoke of women as half of the nation, half of the population, actually, whose participation was necessary for national development as work forces, labor forces in the society. Women were valued, but often instrumentally in that speech, as somebody who is contributed to state building rather than as an autonomous political agents. So this point, rhetoric points to an important paradox if you look carefully. Women's suffrage and related reforms genuinely expanded access to education, political access, and some access to the public life, but because they were framed as gifts from the state rather than achievements of independent mobilization, they also reinforce dependence on the regime that granted these rights eventually.
So I hear that women didn't have much agency in this process. What about women's organizations? For instance, one of the key institutions in this period was Sazman-e Zanan. How did this organization come into being, and what role did it play in shaping women's activism in Iran? How did that ignore women's agency as well?
I mean, following the model that I've explained so far, this is a very revealing example. I mean, the women's organization of Iran, Sazman-e Zanan, because it shows both the vitality of women's activism and the centralizing logic of the state. During the 1950s, 1960s, just right after Second World War, many independent women's organizations were active in education, literacy, legal reform, and social welfare. They were active and they were free, actually. Some were linked to, professional, ethnic or local networks, while others were founded by activists deeply committed to women's rights. So over time, however, I mean, in 1960s, the state became increasingly concerned about the independent organizations, especially the possibility that women's groups might align with leftist politics or develop too much autonomy. You know, that was the era that the state concerned about Cold War and the influence of Soviet Union. So according to the account of Mehran Rezaei, who was one of the prominent feminists at the time, tension emerged when one women's organization was placed under the patronage of Prince Ashraf Pahlavi, the Shah's sister. And they have a kind of exclusive access to the court through that relationship. So there was some complaint by the other organizations because of this exclusive access to the court and the state governmental sources. So they reached out to the Shah, and Shah had a very simple and royal solution. And rather than allowing pluralism and accepting that, a plurality of independent women's activities, the Shah reportedly argued that she should, the Ashraf Pahlavi, the Shah's sister, should head all women's organization instead of just being the head of one of this organization. This led to the creation of High Council of Women's Organization, and then to the consolidation of these groups under the women's organizations of Iran, Sazman Zanan Iran. The result was simply coordinating making a coordination among all of these independent organizations, but at the same time, it was also about centralization of all these activities under the umbrella organization called Sazman Zanan Iran. So independent associations were gradually absorbed into a state umbrella structure. These are the important consequences. The state did achieve real gains in literacy, in health issue for women, and legal awareness. But the price was a loss of autonomy for these independent entities. Independent women's activism was increasingly hollowed out, even when organization, remained formally existing on the paper, they were actually inactive. So in practice, the state shaped the agenda, the leadership, and the international presentation that was really crucial for the government, that was shaped by the government itself.
What about law? Another major reform of the late Pahlavi period was the family protection law. How did that contribute to the consolidation of a centralized authoritarian state?
That's really important as well. The family protection law of 1967, later strengthened in 1975, expanded women's grounds for divorce, restricted polygamy, and raised the minimum age of marriage. The 1975 revision strengthened this protection further. This reform mattered because they shifted some authority over family life away from clerical jurisprudence and male privilege and toward the central state, actually. So in that sense, the law was part of a broader state building process to secularize the legislation. And so the monarchy was not reforming family law. It was related to the government. It was about centralizing legal authority from Shia cleric to secular forces. The process started, from Qajar legal reform and expanded during Pahlavi. There was many a story of what's going on when, for example, Amir Kabir was challenging the legislation, usually supported by the clerics at that time. So these challenges, a long term challenge between the secular modern state and the clerical forces in Iran. Despite this progress, the gains remain tied to authoritarian state power, I would say. They were socially uneven as well. If you look at the context that they were exercising in Iran, because usually it was benefiting urban and middle class and educated women more than rural and poorer women in Iran who lacked actually the sources or proximity to new institutions like schools and courts to know their rights and defend themselves. So actually, it was eventually a uneven achievement for women. But also because the reform were not secured from it was not secured through democratic participation or strong autonomous feminist institutions, they remained politically fragile. That is the main argument that I'm trying to expand in this interview. So the rapid rollback, it is one example. You can see that they rapidly rolled back after the 1979 revolution. That is a reminder of that fragility, I believe. So the reforms were real on the legal scale, but they also revealed the limits of state feminism. Rights could be expanded from above, but that expansion was vulnerable because it depends on legitimacy of the regime rather than on a durable democratic structure or autonomous social movements. So when the state that granted these rights collapsed, they vanish with it, unfortunately.
And you just mentioned that this reform was the product of a longer history of tension between different social forces. So let's explore more deeply about this state feminism you just mentioned and its deeper roots. What were the main forces that produced this model, this state feminism?
Yeah, that's the term that I have been repeatedly used during this interview, state feminism. State feminism in Iran did not emerge from a single cause. It was the result of several overlapping historical and political dynamics. First of all, there was a long-standing demand for reform in Iran, including reform of law, education, and women's status in the society. These demands had deep roots in the constitutionalism, constitutional period in Iran, and the broader struggle that was there over how Iran should be modernized. So, but in the Pahlavi era, such tensions were increasingly resolved not through a democratic negotiation, but through authoritarian state intervention. And the second thing of this state feminism is that it was closely tied to centralized nation-building image, nation-building program actually. So the modern Iranian state sought to organize and standardize society from above. And women's issues became part of that larger project, actually. So women were treated as crucial to producing a disciplined national population, not simply as right-bearing individuals. So they were not targeted in themselves. There was other program that instrumentalized women's. And thirdly, especially in the second Pahlavi period, the monarchy was deeply anxious about independent mobilization, including leftist influence, as I said, because they were in Cold War period. So this helps explain why women's organizations were increasingly sponsored, coordinated, and absorbed by the state, rather than allowing to remain autonomous as it was before, actually. So the rise of Sazman Zanan is a clear example of this logic that happened in 1960s, 1950 and 1960s, actually, because it founded 1966. And fourth element is of the state feminism is that in Iran there was a patriarchal logic that is important as well in state feminism in Iran, and it was actually the logic used by the monarchy. The Shah presented himself as the father of nation, the logic that still you can hear from royalists recently. And women's emancipation was presented as something granted by a benevolent ruler, not claimed by women as a political subject in their own rights. This produced what might be called paternalistic citizenship that I mentioned before. Rights were framed as gifts granted by a ruler, benevolent father, rather than as a as entitlements achieved through a democratic struggle. Shah's own discourse makes this clear. If you look at this, his speech dating back to the time when he was trying to give that entitlements to women. He supported women's inclusion, but did not always frame equality in strong terms, as we expected, as women's movement expected. Even when women's advancement was encouraged by Shah, the underlying assumption was often that state would decide how far reform should go. His 1977 interview of Barbara Walters with Shah, when Shah was interviewed by Barbara, he was reacting to the very challenging question. Farah was next to Shah, and Shah was supposed to answer a question that was challenging based on what he had already mentioned about intellectual equality between men and women. And when challenged on women's intellectual equality, he hesitated and claimed, well, women's, and I quote, have not produced a top scientist. And Marie Curie is just one exception. And there is no any arts like Michelangelo's, shadows, and there is not such kind of artworks by women as well. So there is not intellectual equality as Shah indicated. That was embarrassing for Farah, who was sitting there. So it is really revealing. It's a kind of apt example what is in the mindset of somebody who is supposed to be the champion of women's movement, because it is all about Shah's benevolence. So if the mindset is so, biased about equality, in that case, we couldn't guarantee what will be happen when we give all of this ownership to such a people, to such a man. So due to dependence of state feminism on the government, it is also highly fragile. The Islamic Republic, the Islamic Revolution in 1979, exposed this fragility because many reforms were tied so closely to the monarchy, they could be suspended or reversed when the regime changed. That is a central weekend of the state sponsorship feminism. When rise depends on and actually significantly and mainly on the state, they remained reversible easily when the regimes changed.
Thank you, Dr. Rezaei. So in the end, and as for the concluding remarks, what do you think is the main lesson of the Pahlavi experience of a state feminism for understanding women's rights in Iran today?
So I would like to press on two things, item that is really important as a result of the state feminism. The first one is sustainability or lack of sustainability, I would say, and the second one is lack of integration. In terms of sustainability, the Shah state feminism showed that an authoritarian regime can introduce some reforms for women, of course, and not in a complete version. But if those reforms are not grounded in independent feminist power, democratic participation, or a durable institution, they remain vulnerable and changeable. That is why the Pahlavi case mattered, I believe. It demonstrates that rights granted from above can be effective, slightly at least, but they are also reversible easily. The family protection law is the clearest example because it was not secured through a democratic order, a strong autonomous social movement, so it could be rapidly rolled back after the 1979 revolution by Khomeini's first command just 1 week after the revolution. So the entitlements granted by a father of nation in a month can be undermined in a week by a father of Ummah this time. In terms of integration, politically, state feminism instrumentalized women because the system was highly centralized. Women were often mobilized instrumentally rather than integrated as an autonomous political actors. So that meant the state could encourage women's participation while still limiting the space for independent organization and political pluralism. That is really important and very crucial element of state feminism. This had reversal consequences for the system itself. That is also important because some women who were mobilized and benefited from state did not remain loyal to the regime. Many later joined, during that time when the Sazman Zanan were active, many of them were joined oppositional currents, left or religious political parties and groups and collectives. And so, that is against the intention behind that state program. So many of them were mobilized by the new political atmosphere, but joined the revolution against the system. So that was upsetting, really, for Shah. When in the last few days, ironically, he said to his Minister of State's Women's Affairs, Mahnouza Afkhami, saying, "Your women, the women that you were trying to mobilize them, they are now in the street and chanting against me." And he said something that really important, because he noticed that mobilization, abstract mobilization, was against him. Overall, the Pahlavi experience remains so relevant today because it reminds us that women's rights cannot secure simply through state-led reform. Like many other social movements, people are the first and the final units of revolutions. Revolutions, especially for women's demand, could not be white, I believe, and they do not whiten states' projects and ambitions. They belong to people and who make them, and they don't belong to states that orchestrates the social changes.
That was a very important concluding remark. Thank you, Dr. Rezaei, for this illuminating and nuanced discussion that revealed the true complexities of Pahlavi-era state feminism and cut through some nostalgic images of it. Thank you for accepting this interview with us today.
Thank you very much, Sana.